Okay, the reading for this week is the next part in our series on Japanese civilization, culture, society, and we will be reading now Ōkuma Shigenobu's Illusions of the White Race, an essay that he published in 1921. Ōkuma Shigenobu, born in 1838, so in this latter half of the Tokugawa or Edo period. If you haven't memorized the dates of the major periods of Japanese history, do so immediately. I will provide the dates below in the description. So today we are dealing with somebody who was born in the latter half of the Edo period and lived through the Meiji period, the Meiji Restoration, the Meiji Ishin, and the Meiji period, and then through the most of the Taishō period, and died in the latter half of the Taishō period in 1922. Just to review very briefly, Edo period 1604 or so to 1868, when we have the Meiji Restoration, Meiji Ishin, and then we have the Meiji period from 1868 to 1912, and then the Taishō period from 1912 to 1926, and then the Shōwa period after that, which lasts all the way to 1989. Okay, so Ōkuma Shigenobu was one of the leaders of the Meiji Restoration, of the Meiji Ishin, and a leading modernizer and statesman in late 19th and early 20th century Japan. Ōkuma served as Japan's Minister of Finance, Foreign Minister, and on two occasions in 1898 and 1914-16 as Prime Minister. He also was the founder of Waseda University, which is one of the major, more prestigious private universities in Tokyo. It's where I first studied when I came to Japan as a Tokubetsu Kenkyūin back in 2005 or 2006 or so. And if you go to the campus there's a big statue of Ōkuma Shigenobu right in the middle of the campus, as he was the founder of the university. In this essay, which was written just before his death, he died in 1922, essay in 1921, Ōkuma captures long-standing Japanese resentments of racially motivated discriminations at the hands of the Western powers. The recent Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, you remember that the First World War lasts from 1914 to 1918, after which is the Versailles Peace Conference, which the Japanese had high expectations for, but ended up being very disappointing for the Japanese. The recent Versailles Peace Conference is certainly fresh in Ōkuma's mind as he's writing this essay, as the Japanese delegates there had proposed a racial equality clause in the Covenant of the League of Nations, only to be rebuffed by Australian, American, and European resistance. Okay, so much of the Meiji period, the Japanese spent building a modern nation that would rival the great imperial powers of the West, and by the Taishō period, Japanese thought they had pretty much caught up to the Western powers, but they ended up being very disappointed when they were sort of ignored at this Versailles Peace Conference in 1919. And in the 1920s, anger over American racism would flare up once again, especially in the wake of the Immigration Act of 1924, which is often called the Asian Exclusion Act, which sought to block Japanese migration to the United States. Okay, so racism, the issue of racism, the issue of Western imperialism, of sort of hierarchy of races that is found in much of the Western imperialist discourse, gets imported to Japan in the Meiji period, and Japanese sort of critique it while also adopting it in some ways. So it's the Japanese Empire's relation to these racial discourses is quite complex. At times it seems that they're criticizing it and advocating for a sort of equality for all human brothers, all human men, all humans. And other times it seems that they adopt this racial hierarchy that arose in the 18th century, 19th century in Europe, and they sort of put themselves up with the white race and look down at the other Asian peoples in surrounding nations. All right. Now the excerpt from this essay is taken from a book published in 1921, What Japan Thinks. So the English is slightly old, and there's some strange orthography or spelling, and we'll have to sort of fix that as we read it, as we look over it in class. Right now I'm just going to read the entire two excerpts. Before I do that, though, I'm going to read the 4 questions on your question on your study guide. And the study guide, the PDF worksheet, by the way, is once again provided by Columbia University. Somebody that's university put these together and made them available online. I'll put the link to these worksheets in the description below. Question number 1. What are Ōkuma's main arguments here? What kind of evidence does he use to support his points? Do you agree with him? Okay, so what is his main claim here? Question number 2. Does Ōkuma himself see all races and nationalities as equal? Where does he believe Japan stands in the world? What yardstick does he use for measuring Japan's status? Okay, so explicitly he's sort of critiquing racist and racial discourses, but there might be some underlying sort of racial or racialistic attitudes that are kind of hidden in his discourse. So we'll look into that in class. Number 3, how do you think you would have responded to this piece as an American political leader at the time? And question number 4, does it change your opinion of Ōkuma and this document to know that Ōkuma himself was a nobleman? So he's born in the upper ranks of the Japanese aristocracy, holding the elevated title of Marquis, one of the highest ranks in the Japanese peerage. Peerage is the word for the gazoka, which is sort of the highest ranking class in Japan that dates its ancestry to the classical period. Alright, and now here is the essay. I will read it with some scattered commentary. Illusions of the White Race by Ōkuma Shigenobu. And this question wasn't in the included among the 4 questions, but you might want to add it. So as we read this essay, let's think about how it relates or how it compares to more contemporary race discourses, such as, for example, in America right now you see critical race theory, which is very popular in the media and in universities and so forth. And we can compare the sort of racialistic ideas that are put forth in critical race theory in America with these ideas that were popular in Imperial Japan in the 1910s, 1920s, and compare their attitudes and contrast their attitudes. Okay. Okay, here's the essay. The Renaissance during the Middle Ages stimulated the progress of the material civilization in Europe and helped the Europeans to grow richer and stronger than the Asiatic races who kept on slumbering in their old civilization. Being seized by an insatiable, aggressive desire, the Europeans took full advantage of their lethargy and swooped down on India and other parts of Asia. So he's talking about the colonization of India and of China and Japan, of course. The U.S. Navy gunboats led by Matthew Perry arrived in the 1850s and forced Japan to open, but Japan learned from the West, and they learned to adopt Western ideas and Western techniques in military and so forth in order to avoid colonization, and they ended up successfully avoiding being colonized by the Western powers. Okay, swooped down on India and other parts of Asia. They either conquered the Asiatic peoples by force or dominated them by dint of superior economic organization, or cheated them out of their territories. The ascendance of the white races is due to the fact that they came into the possession of material civilization a little earlier than their non-white brothers. Okay, so there's nothing intrinsically superior about the white race in his view. They simply happen to develop modern technology and modern methods of warfare and so forth a little bit before their non-white brothers, he says here. The white are obsessed with the mistaken theory that they are superior to all other races. This is the most serious obstacle in the way of the realization of racial equality. Okay, so if the white people could just get over their sense of racial superiority, racism would disappear from the earth, is his claim here. Now the Japanese, the Chinese, the Mongolians, the Turks, the Indians, the Afghans, the Persians, the Arabs, the Malayans, and the American Aborigines, he's referring to the American natives here, and the African peoples are all non-white. They are all held in contempt by the whites. And it is the common belief among the whites that the darker the skin, the more inferior the race. Okay, keep in mind too, whenever you hear this sort of white discourse about whiteness and racial theories and so forth, the idea of whiteness and who qualifies as white changes drastically over the ages and according to which country. So in the beginning, the discourse about whiteness referred specifically to land-owning members of the aristocracy and gentry in Britain. Everyone else was not included in this category of whiteness. So Italians were not in it, Jews were not in it, Armenians were not in it, the Irish were not in it. And then slowly it expanded to include more and more groups of people, so that now people throw around the word white, whereas historically most of the people that are now included in this category of whiteness were not considered white at all, right? All right, so keep that in mind as whenever you hear this talk about whiteness. It's not a real category, really. It's sort of made up, and it changes with time. They are all held in contempt by the whites, and it is the common belief among the whites that the darker the skin, the more inferior is the race. It is based neither upon science nor upon any positive experience. It is mere superstition backed by historical prejudices. Okay, so he's saying that the idea that whites are superior in any way is mere superstition. It's not scientific, but he takes as granted this idea that there exists something called the white race, which is also a kind of superstition backed by historical prejudices, but he's unaware of that superstition, right? The whites are of the conviction that they are too superior a people to be governed by their non-white fellows. Therefore, they demand the privilege of extraterritoriality in the countries of the Asiatic races. Underline extraterritoriality. This is the a legal idea that the colonizers in their colonized lands are not subject to the laws of the colonized. So the British, for example, who are in China, if there are laws of extraterritoriality, it means the British are not subject to Chinese laws and can do whatever they like there as long as they're in conformity with their own laws back home in England. They establish their own courts and trample underfoot the laws and courts of Asiatic countries. Of all the non-white countries, Japan had taken the lead in adopting the best parts of European civilization. So he's referring to the Bunmei Kaika, Japan's project of westernization that took place in the Meiji period. Bunmei Kaika is, of course, the very important slogan from that period, meaning enlightenment and civilization. So Japan had taken the lead in adopting the best parts of European civilization, including its military side. So lead is an important word here. He sees Japan as the leader of all the Asiatic people, and he sort of expects or thinks it takes it as natural that the other peoples of Asia should follow them in resisting the white man's domination, is the underlying thesis here in this essay. Including its military side, Japan, she codified her laws and reformed her police and judicial systems, her military and naval forces, thus placing herself almost on an equal footing with that of the European countries. So almost on equal footing, right? And according to most accounts, though, among Japanese intellectuals and writers, Japan spent most of the Meiji period trying to catch up with the West, and then by the Taishō period, they had pretty much done so and caught up with the West socially, culturally, and politically. Therefore, the Europeans were compelled to withdraw their extraterritorial rights from Japan. Okay, so whereas in other countries the extraterritorial rights still existed, the Japanese had caught up with the West enough to the point that Westerners now sort of respected them and ended up withdrawing their extraterritorial rights from the country. Some whites regarded the development of Japan as an unjustifiable encroachment upon their own rights. They either instigate a non-white race against Japan, so he's referring here perhaps to the Chinese whenever the Americans or the British support China against vis-a-vis Japan, the Japanese regard this as instigating a non-white race against Japan, or the Westerners plan to organize a league of the white nations to perpetuate a white supremacy in the world. So this resentment against the white nations, or what they regard as the white nations, white Western imperialism, is beginning to build in this period, and it will of course culminate in Japan's revolt against the West in 1941 with the attack on Pearl Harbor and the all-out war against the United States and Great Britain. to perpetuate a white supremacy in the world. Be it remembered, however, that no unjust and unreasonable agitation against this country will ever succeed, as God never sides with an unjust cause. Okay, so there's a sort of nationalist, anti-Western, anti-imperialistic tone in this sentence here, and he's showing that he's absolutely convinced that he is on the right side of history, and that the Japanese, the project of Japanese imperialization and unification of Asia under the Japanese flag is a just cause in his view. It is of course true that there are still peoples in this world who are so backward in civilization that they cannot at once be admitted into the international family on an equal footing. But it will never do to give discriminatory treatment to them. So he's saying basically, yes, there are still savages around us in Asia and the rest of the world, but we must not treat them discriminatorily, that we must sort of bring them into our greater project of the great co-prosperity sphere. Daitowa is what it's called in Japanese. We'll review that in class. What is needed by them is proper guidance and direction. So we must lead we must direct and guide and lead the benighted, less civilized peoples of Asia. And when they have reached a certain stage of civilization, they should be given an equal place and rank in the comity of the nations. Okay, so this is sort of the justification for Japanese imperialism that you would see used throughout the 1920s and 30s, well, 30s really, starting with the Manchurian incident and so forth, and then all throughout the Second Sino-Japanese War. Although most Asiatic nations are fully peers of European nations, yet they are discriminated against because of the color of their skin. So the Japanese kind of see themselves as saviors of the Asiatic peoples, saviors from the white Western imperialists. And of course, much of this turned out to be mere justification of their own brutal policies in East Asia. The root of it lies in the perverted feeling of racial superiority entertained by the whites. If things are allowed to proceed in the present way, there is every likelihood that the peace of the world will be endangered. And of course it would be endangered, and we would, 16 years later, Japan and the rest of the world would embark upon the bloodiest war in human history. It therefore behooves all well-wishers of mankind to exert their utmost to remove this gross injustice immediately. Okay, that's the end of this first section. Now we have the second section here. I will read that as well and then wrap up this lesson. Okay, continuing, he writes, Confucius, the ancient sage of China, taught that all peoples of the earth were brethren. Shakyamuni, okay, note the orthography is a little bit strange here. It says Shakyamuni as two words. Today we would render this as Shakyamuni. Shakyamuni, the founder of Buddhism, preached that all human beings were equal, while Christ emphasized the necessity of philanthropy. They were the founders of the three leading religions. They came into the world at different times and in different places, yet their teachings unquestionably centered upon the truth and the necessity of human equality. God makes no discrimination against any race or any man. So in Christianity and Judaism, for example, you see God, or in the book of Genesis, for example, all men are icons of God, right? Men are made in the image and likeness of God is the famous line from Genesis. He's referring to that here. Men are created equal and have equal rights, but not only in Judeo-Christianity, but in Confucianism and in Buddhism as well, he's saying. With the steadily increasing propagation of mankind, the struggle for existence has been growing keener and keener, tending toward the dominance of the stronger over the weaker, who is groaning pitiably under inhuman oppression. So he's referring here to social Darwinism that kind of emerges as a scientific discourse in the or sociological discourse in the 19th century. And it's the idea that the stronger will eat the gobble up the weaker, right? Not only in the animal kingdom, but in the human kingdom as well, leading to inhuman oppression. The strong, having step by step come to occupy an advantageous position in society, the class system has gradually been established. So he's acknowledging the class system. You remember by 1921, the class situation in Japan was pretty terrible. The rich capitalists kind of owned all the wealth in the country and owned the means of production, while the great masses, the multitude, worked for low wages, and they're increasingly wait, I lost my place here, hold on. Precarious position. Okay, here's the next sentence. And it is through such processes that nobles, commons, and slaves have come to exist. Okay. And you'll remember for the last lesson we read the Kokutai no Hongi, and in that work, which was published 16 years later in 1937, there's also a recognition of this class system that emerges. But in that work, the author of the essay says that Japan has a similar sort of class struggle and class inequality in Japan, but unlike the Western nations, the Japanese are able to overcome that sort of class inequality due to their understanding of this concept of wa, of harmony, right? But we'll talk about that later in class. And it's through such processes that nobles, commons, and slaves have come to exist. We may read with pride the pages of our Japanese history in which slaves do not figure. So unlike Europe and America, where slaves have been a prominent part of their history for centuries, millennia, Japan has never had slaves, is what he's bragging about here. There are circumstances which make us doubt whether our ancestors in their conquest of the Korean peninsula did not bring the vanquished warriors of the Ye and Myaku tribes of Korea to Japan and force them into the occupations which were held in contempt by the natives, such as footgear makers, butchers, and janitors, but the authenticity of this fact remains to be proved. The history of Europe is black with its barbarous record of reducing the vanquished warriors to slaves, but the Japanese, by contrast, he's implying here, do not reduce the vanquished warriors of the enemy nation to slaves. Even modern Europe did not develop a conscience strong enough to bring about the abolition of this baneful system of slavery, and not until the slave system became a fitting tool to force civil war in America did we see its end even there. So even in America, this beacon of progressive ideas and so forth still retained the barbaric practice of slavery up until just 4 or 5 or 6 decades earlier. The Negroes in America, now numbering more than 11 million, are not yet emancipated in the true sense of the word. Okay, so whenever you see the non-Western powers of this time talk about America, they often bring up the subject of racism and slavery in America as part of their critique against the Western powers. And yet even the Negroes are not yet emancipated in the true sense of the word. The American law prohibits all invidious discrimination against the Negroes, yet they are subjected to constant persecutions by the Americans, whose prejudices against them are too deep-rooted to be removed by the mere promulgation of laws. Worst of all, the Negroes in America are frequently lynched, a vindictive method, the parallel of which cannot be found in the history of even the barbarians of the world. Okay, so again he's claiming that Americans are, despite their pretenses of being proponents of civilization, are in fact barbarians, more barbaric than the world's so-called barbarians. The example set by Japan has convinced the other Asiatic races of the possibility on their part to be on equal footing with the white races, if only they reform their political system and adopt the needed portion of European civilization. In other words, the rise of Japan and the consequent abolition of extraterritoriality have exploded the superstition that the world is to be ruled by the whites. Okay, so in the 19th century, he's claiming here, a lot of the non-Western world thought it was only natural that they should be ruled by the whites, right, who are their superiors. But this superstition this delusion has been exploded by the example of Japan, which has risen onto the global stage and is now respected by all nations of the world, right? So the Japanese have shown the rest of the world that non-white, non-Western nations can rise to the top too, is what he's saying. In this connection, the whites at first believed that Japan's civilization was a mere imitation, or a mere veneer, and that it was only fine in appearance, but entirely hollow in reality, and void of sustaining qualities. The result of the Sino-Japanese War, however, so this is Japan's first war against China, against late Qing dynasty China in this case, 1894 to 1895. The result of this war, however, was a great surprise to the Europeans. So Japan surprised Europe by defeating the Qing dynasty in this war. And once again, 10 years later, in 1905, again the Europeans were taken aback by the outcome of the Russo-Japanese War, in which Russia, one of the strongest white nations, notice that he includes Russians within the category of whiteness here. I think most Europeans, most British in 1921 would probably be a little hesitant to include Russians in this category of whiteness, arbitrary category of whiteness. One of the strongest white nations with a powerful army was beaten by a non-white nation of the earth. So this is the famous war of 1904 to 1905, in which Japan shocked the world by defeating Tsarist Russia. But what happened after the Russo-Japanese War came as a miserable disappointment to the whites. Since the war with Russia, Japan's industry witnessed a phenomenal development. Hitherto, she was entirely dependent upon other countries for the supply of machinery and industrial products, but after the war she began to export her industrial products and machines to the outside world, thus changing her status from that of importer to that of exporter. Just as Japan's success in warfare testified to her military strength, development of her industry, shipping, and commerce accounts for the growing national wealth. In consequence, the white peoples have been obliged to give up their mistaken idea about Japan. Thus Japan has demonstrated the possibility on the part of the non-white races to take rank with the white people, if only they exert themselves. Okay, that's the end of this. These two fat chunks from this essay by Ōkuma Shigenobu, founder of Waseda University and Prime Minister twice, and Minister of Finance, Foreign Minister, and member of the Gazoku, or the highest, the peerage, as it's called in English. Okay, we'll discuss more about this in class and the racial discourse of the 1920s in Japan. And that is all for now. I will see you then. Goodbye.